Good afternoon. I'm John Fernandez. I'm going to take a few minutes to give an introduction. In fact, we were just figuring out that my introduction might be a third of the length of Senator Whitehouse's comments. So I have a number of things to say. But I think this will also be useful as people stream in, make their way around the construction. So I'm the director of the Environmental Solutions Initiative on behalf of MIT and ESI's executive director, Amanda Graham. I welcome you to the second talk in this year's People and the Planet lecture series. Today, we're privileged to have Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. You may know that last year, we hosted former Republican Congressman and committed environmentalist Bob Inglis, a deep red conservative and founder of Republic EN. I hope you will see a certain symmetry in our invitations to both Inglis and Whitehouse. Two individuals greatly distant from one another on the political spectrum who nonetheless share respect for science and reason and see climate change as a primary challenge of our time. As the director of the Environmental Solutions Initiative, I have the privilege of helping to direct MIT's capacity towards solutions to address climate change and environmental challenges generally. The ESI has so far provided support to upwards 100 MIT faculty in research and teaching on climate change and the environment, and I see many in the room today. The ESI has also launched an environment and sustainability minor open to all MIT undergraduates, and we've partnered with professors to infuse environmental topics into the fundamental STEM learning that is at the core of MIT's educational mission. The ESI is joined in MIT's commitment to the environment by all 5 schools and many departments, including the Departments of Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences, Urban Studies and Planning, and Civil and Environmental Engineering, among many others. We're also joined in this work by the Energy Initiative, the Joint Program on Science and Policy of Climate Change, the Abdul Latif Jameel World Water and Food Security Lab, and again, many other groups on campus and beyond. We're all working with our particular scope of activities toward a low-carbon, sustainable, climate-safe, and humane future. All of this is happening during extraordinary times. We've seen the world come together in Paris 2 years ago to agree on the need for resources to shift towards a low-carbon, low-emitting future. We're also now witness to the extraordinary development that the United States is the only country not participating in that agreement. We now have in hand the 4th National Climate Assessment Report, a report issued by the White House, which again unequivocally asserts the overwhelming role of human activities in a rapidly changing climate. And at the same time, the current nominee for the White House's Council on Environmental Quality continues to assert that she's still not certain about the role of human activities in a warming climate. I just returned recently from Bonn, Germany, where 50 kilometers from the ongoing climate discussions of the COP23 is the location of the world's largest open-pit coal mine, mining lignite, the lowest quality and highest polluting type of coal that exists. I mention this not to diminish the unwavering and undeniable commitment of Germany that Germany has shown to address climate change, but to point out a key element of our coupled political and biogeochemical reality. International agreements must be followed through with local actions. And by local, I mean at the national and subnational level. This is why we invited the senator to deliver this talk, America's Climate Future. For despite the steady global move toward a low-carbon world, each country is left to map out its own specific path. The result is that politicians at every level of national and subnational government are on the front lines for the decisions that will lead to a safe world, or will lead to one that is beset by natural catastrophe and economic and social instability. Priorities for jobs, security, health, and welfare are all within a public servant's scope of concerns, and there is no doubt as to the complexity of the balance between these priorities and the critical need to protect the common good, our air, water, natural capital, biodiversity. But during extraordinary times, we begin to ask ourselves, what will we answer to our children and grandchildren, to the generations to come for 1,000 years? What did you do when the climate started to change? What role did you play when seas overtook coastlines and redrew continental maps and superstorms inundated entire cities and led to mass migrations. These are not questions of the future any longer. These are questions for today, and each of us will have to answer these questions in our own way. For Senator Whitehouse, I can suggest the answers are already pretty clear. The senator has played a central role in striving for humane and honest governance, continuing the long legacy begun with the founding fathers of policy and legislation based on reason, humanity, science, and responsible industry. He's therefore acted as one of the most, if not the most, vocal, well-informed, passionate, and reliable voices in taking climate action. Before the political phase of his career in 1982, Sheldon Whitehouse worked as a clerk for Judge Richard Neely of the Supreme Court of Appeals in West Virginia, and soon afterwards in the Rhode Island Attorney General's office, first as a Special Assistant Attorney General, then Chief of the Regulatory Unit, and then as Assistant Attorney General. In 1994, Whitehouse was appointed by President Bill Clinton to be the United States Attorney for the District of Rhode Island. He served in that role for 4 years before being elected as the 71st Attorney General of Rhode Island. In 2007, Sheldon Whitehouse became Senator Whitehouse, defeating Republican Lincoln Chafee, and in 2012, he was reelected. During his tenure, he has supported stem cell research, abortion rights, LGBT rights, and gay marriage, as well as affirmative action and a reintroduction of the Equal Rights Amendment. In 2011, he was founding co-chair with Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski of the Senate Oceans Caucus, a bipartisan group working to increase awareness and find common ground in responding to issues facing the oceans and coasts. He is co-author with Melanie Wachtel-Stinnett, who's in the audience today, of the book Captured: The Corporate Infiltration of American Democracy. So because we have a public servant in the room, maybe several, I'd like to offer a quote from the Federalist Papers, actually Federalist Paper number 71. James Mattis and John J. Alexander Hamilton wrote, "When occasions present themselves in which the interests of the people are at variance with their inclinations, it is the duty of the persons whom they have appointed to be the guardians of those interests to withstand the temporary delusion in order to give them time and opportunity for more cool and sedate reflection. In our extraordinary times and our extraordinarily contentious times, we are due for some more cool and sedate reflection. We're also due for action and solutions. In hosting the senator this evening, we intend to take one more step in advancing MIT's unique role in providing the conditions for reason and action on climate change and the environment. Please welcome Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.
Thank you. Thank you, John. It is a great pleasure for a Rhode Islander to be able to come north and visit our northern suburb. I appreciate the warm Massachusetts welcome, and I'm thrilled to be here at such a great institution. For more than a century and a half, MIT has been home, as much as any place in this nation, to the enterprise of science. That has been an important and proud role for many of our great universities, but none more than this one. And in this role, our universities have produced wonderful discoveries and fueled technological progress. In this, the era of climate change, we need more than ever the guidance and innovation of science to make the right decisions. So I'm honored to be a part of this conversation. I'll start with a simple proposition. The faster you're going, the better your headlights need to be. As the rate of change in the world accelerates, more and more we need good headlights to see down the road and avert oncoming hazards. Science gives mankind those headlights. And there's the rub. More and more, the role of science to identify oncoming hazards, particularly hazards to public health, puts the scientific enterprise into conflict with industries whose industrial product or byproduct is that hazard. The result of this conflict is a dark, new industry, science denial. The enterprise of science now has a rival, an industrial strength rival, a rival that apes science's form, but has the perverted purpose to defeat the influence of science on public policy. There has always been skepticism of scientific discoveries that change society's settled expectations. From Galileo's work that exploded heliocentrism, to Darwin and the evolutionists, whose work is still challenged in certain circles today, to Einstein's determination of relativity among energy and matter. In his book, The War on Science, Sean Otto relates how, and I quote here, right-wing relativity deniers mounted ad hominem attacks against Einstein and loudly branded general relativity a hoax, despite, or perhaps because of, its recent dramatic scientific confirmation by tests during the 1919 solar eclipse. Ominously, anti-relativity rallies in Germany condemned the theory's Jewish nature. The machinery I'm discussing today may prey on that latent skepticism, but it is a new and different creature. Here is its history. Years ago, scientific and medical studies began to reveal the hazards of tobacco. That science was potentially devastating to the cigarette makers. So they invented an entity which they called the Tobacco Institute to push out counterfactual views about the safety of smoking. It's almost quaint now that the flimsy academic veneer of the name Tobacco Institute was enough to gain credibility then for the tobacco industry's propaganda. But then this was the primitive age of corporate subterfuge. I ran across a similar outfit when, as Attorney General of Rhode Island, I filed the state's lawsuit against the lead paint industry for the harms that product inflicted on thousands of Rhode Island children. Under the scrutiny of that lawsuit, the industry just shut the group down rather than have its agents answer questions under oath. Well, the good old days of a Philip Morris hiding behind a tobacco institute have gone the way of the biplane and the Model T. Industrial interests have now built a sophisticated network of front groups and think tanks, stabled with paid-for scientists, and deployable on command to sow doubt about scientific issues. To use Jane Mayer's memorable phrase from her extraordinary book, Dark Money, this is the think tank as disguised political weapon. Scholarly work by Michigan State's Aaron McWright, Oklahoma State's Riley Dunlap, Yale's Justin Farrell, and Drexel's Robert Brule, among others, has revealed an intricate, interconnected propaganda web that encompasses over 100 organizations, trade associations, think tanks, foundations, public relations firms, and plain old phony baloney polluter front groups. The masking nowadays is much better than a tobacco institute, but the industry strategy behind the clever new masks remains about the same. As David Michaels of George Washington University described in his well-titled book, Doubt is Their Product, the original tobacco industry handbook for thwarting health, safety, and environmental regulation has persisted. Simply put, it is to create faux science that looks enough like real science to create the illusion of controversy, to deprecate real science, thus to delay or defeat regulation. So scientists have a powerful, invasive, new alien in their ecosystem. It is a rival, assuredly, a mimic at best, and an outright predator at worst. Science will have to adapt to this new predator. If science is to continue its public function of warning and enlightenment, to be our headlights, real science must distinguish itself from this new competitor. For all of our sakes, science needs to win this competition. Happily, in a few corners, science is fighting back, using the tools of science. Academic researchers are shining the light of peer-reviewed science into this disinformation machine. They're not alone. Investigative journalists, attorneys general, and even the odd member of Congress are also wielding spotlights. Let's examine what their work shows about this new and cunning predator. Almost exactly 50 years ago, back in those quaint good old days I mentioned, a tobacco industry memo crystallized the fundamental modus operandi of the science denial effort. The memo famously said, "Doubt is our product. Since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public, it is also the means of establishing a controversy." Doubt is our product to compete with the body of fact. So, point one, the predator has an opening advantage. It doesn't need to win the dispute with real science. It just has to create the illusion of a real dispute. Point two, the rival also has the advantage of complexity. Today, like the mythic Hydra, the fossil fuel industry, for instance, controls a many-tentacled apparatus to deny climate science. The number of these groups allows industry to hide behind multiple masks, generate on command what appears to be a crowd, and run multi-organization razzle-dazzle plays. In the words of Professor Farrell, the apparatus is, and I quote him here, overtly producing and promoting skepticism and doubt about scientific consensus on climate change. This web of science denial must hide its handlers to be effective. The Koch brothers' political operation is at the heart of climate denial, and a Koch brothers operative early on described the tactic when this whole web was being developed for climate use. He said, "It would be necessary to use ambiguous and misleading names, obscure the true agenda, and conceal the means of control." So, point three, obscurity. The front group's names can be anonymously bland, like the Annapolis Council, or cloyingly sweet, like the Heartland Institute, or falsely patriotic, like the Franklin Center for Government and Policy Integrity, with a profile of Old Ben on its logo, or the Thomas Jefferson Institute for Public Policy. As you know, Franklin and Jefferson were renowned amateur scientists of their day. So the misuse of their names in the service of science denial is particularly irksome. The funding is made obscure by outfits like Donors Trust, an entity whose only function is to launder donor identities that might otherwise reveal the industry hand within the think tank glove. Point 4, researchers have observed that the front groups tend to avoid the tests of legitimate science. Harvard's Naomi Oreskes conducted a peer-reviewed survey of peer-reviewed climate science abstracts. Her work put the score among those peer-reviewed climate science abstracts at 928 to 0 to recognize anthropogenic climate change. That may seem like an embarrassingly bad score. 928 to 0 seems like a hell of a thumping. But they don't care what scientists think. Scientists are not their audience. Scientists are their rival. Plus, if they went into those contests, they'd lose because they can't meet the high standard of peer review. So instead, they go straight to Fox News and talk radio. They bombard editorial pages. They fight for equal time with real science in the legitimate news. And in various ways, they talk directly to an uninformed and often gullible public, bypassing the tests of real science. Remember, this isn't science, after all. It's public relations in a lab coat. And PR wants to go straight to its audience. So let's summarize the advantages that science's rival has over real science. It's better adapted to getting its message out. It only has to create dispute, even the illusion of dispute, to achieve its ends. It evades even identification through complexity, coordination, and concealment. And it has an ulterior motive, a distinct and constant purpose upon which it is singly focused. Let me add one more advantage. Science's rival enjoys virtually unlimited funding. This is disheartening, but logical when you consider the stakes of their game. The conflict of interest motivating the hidden backers behind this science denial scheme is massive. Just consider climate change. The International Monetary Fund ran an estimate of the effective subsidy for fossil fuels in the United States. Now, the IMF is a reasonably intelligent and informed group. Their folks have no apparent conflict of interest. They put the subsidy for fossil fuels in the United States at $700 billion per year. To protect a multi-$100 billion subsidy, you can afford to fund a lot of front groups. So the big carbon polluters are not just polluting our atmosphere and oceans. They are polluting our democracy. With the stakes I described, there is plenty of money for political artillery, and unleashed by Citizens United, the industry has used that artillery to drive the Republican Party to the industry's heel. The industrial polluters, by sheer force of political spending, bullying, and threats, have made of the Republican Party, the party of Teddy Roosevelt, the party that started the Environmental Protection Agency, their political tool. Given the connections between the fossil fuel industry and the new administration, we can't count on government any longer to resist the predator of science denial. Regrettably, science denial's machinery is now hardwired into the current administration, which has even set about deleting the words climate change from agency websites. The Washington Post reported in September that Environmental Protection Agency Public Affairs Officer John Caucus, quote, told staff that he's on the lookout for the double C word, climate change, and repeatedly has instructed grant officers to eliminate references to the subject in solicitations. Last month, in my home state of Rhode Island, the EPA pulled 3 agency-affiliated scientists from a scheduled speaking engagement. The remarks were to be part of a larger event to announce the release of a Narragansett Bay Estuary Program report on the state of the bay. The report took 3 years to complete, and it identified over 20 indicators and stressors, including climate change, that shape the health and recovery of the Narragansett Bay watershed. Pulling the agency scientists from an opportunity to speak about their work and the growing threat of climate change to Narragansett Bay sends a chilling message to scientists throughout the agency. This is the denial machinery's new threat to the enterprise of legitimate science. The hand of industry now works not just behind the science denial front groups, but in the halls of political power. Not since the Inquisition has science faced an institutional adversary of this scale. That makes it all the more important for entities outside government, particularly for our great universities, as well as other scientific organizations, to join together and step up a common defense. If a science building caught fire, you wouldn't leave it to the scientists to fight the fire. You'd call the fire department, because the fire department has the equipment and the skills to fight the fire. If a crime were committed in a lab, you wouldn't leave it to the scientists to solve the crime. You'd call the police department, because the police department has the equipment and the skills to solve the crime. If someone fell ill in a science class, you wouldn't leave it to the science teacher to give medical aid. You'd call the rescue department, because the rescue department has the equipment and the skills to provide the aid. In the same way, the science enterprise needs a group that has the equipment and the skills to defend the enterprise of science. Scientists are trained in the pursuit of truth through the tested methods of science. The science denial machinery has truth as its enemy, and propaganda and obfuscation, even outright falsity, as its method. So the enterprise of science generally, and universities specifically, will need a common strategy to resist this potent and encroaching adversary. Leaving individual scientists with no training in the dark arts they face is unfair to them and will fail. Now, daylight is one response, and thankfully, academics, scientists, and journalists have begun exposing that science denial apparatus and setting the record straight. So thank you to Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway for their book, Merchants of Doubt, to Jeff Nesbitt for his book, Poison Tea, and to Gerald Markowitz and David Rosner for their book, Deceit and Denial. Thank you also to Jerry and David for their Toxic Docs database with more than 4 million corporate memos, minutes, letters, and reports on environmental and occupational poisons, modeled on the tobacco industry document trove. And by the way, thank you to the attorneys general who set up that tobacco document trove. Thank you as well to journalists Neela Banerjee, Lisa Song, David Hasemeyer, and John Cushman Jr. of Inside Climate News and the Parallel Probe by the Energy and Environment Fellowship Project at Columbia Journalism School for exposing what ExxonMobil knew about climate change while it spewed falsehoods through this network to the public. Thank you to many others engaged on the good side of this elemental struggle for truth against falsehood. Ladies and gentlemen, the science denial apparatus run by the polluters is a threat. It is a threat to the scientific endeavor, and it is a threat in particular to science's role to warn us in time of hazards ahead, to be our headlights. It seeks to mimic science and vie with the scientific enterprise for influence on policy. It is concerned more with publicity than accuracy. It is highly motivated and well-resourced. It is a menace to the public health, safety, and welfare, and it needs to be treated accordingly. Back to climate change. If we are to avoid the most catastrophic effects of carbon pollution and preserve for our children and grandchildren a world something like the one we knew growing up, it's time that the facts assert their rightful place in our national debate. And we in Congress, you in America's great universities, corporations across America, and American citizens everywhere need to make this a point as we go forward to what I hope will be a strong American recovery from the dark moment we are in right now with respect to climate change. Thank you for having me here, and I'm happy to take questions for however long John will let me go. Have at it. We got a hand up back here.
Hi, Michael Davidson,
Hi,
PhD
Michael.
student here. Thank you for your talk. So I have a question. I follow begrudgingly what the House Science Committee is doing to EPA and science on the Hill. And I'm just wondering, what can we do to kind of stop that agenda? You know, they've put a lot of bills out, but it seems like that's entirely driven by just the chairman, and it seems like there's very little that we can do. But that's kind of the epicenter, as far as I can see, in terms of the science denialism that's being institutionalized in our government. So, thank you.
I think that science denial connects back into this apparatus that I spoke about. So helping people out that apparatus is really important. Robert Brule's work ought to be on the front page of every newspaper, but instead you've got to go fishing for it into the dark corners of the internet and dig it out. It simply has not received the attention it deserves. There ought to be a reflex when people see the name George C. Marshall Institute or Heartland Institute or Heritage Foundation, where they know, that's part of that phony baloney climate and science denial group. And we haven't won that battle, so that makes it difficult. The second is we need to connect the money. When Citizens United opened up enormous amounts of unlimited money into politics, it did not take the political influencers long to figure out the ways to hide their identity and to make that money dark money. That should be a national priority to cure that. And we had at least 8 votes on the Supreme Court for a law that would do that. So that's within our power to do. I guess those would be the most immediate things. On the funding of EPA, I wouldn't worry too much because the budgets that the Trump administration has proposed have been so wildly irresponsible that even the Republicans haven't wanted to deal with them in the House and the Senate. So Mulvaney essentially had no role in the funding measure that passed back in, I guess, early April. And we're coming to the next funding measure in December, and knock on wood, he'll have an equivalent role next time because their budget simply doesn't make sense. And it's impossible for Republicans to go back and defend why they eliminated Meals on Wheels, for instance. So I think the funding is okay. The danger that's out there is by destroying the organization of the EPA, you can do lasting damage. And if you don't have congressional oversight to drill into what's going on within the agency, they can get away with a lot more. So the fact that Republicans control the oversight agencies in the House and in the Senate means that there's no effective oversight, and the result is that you can do enormous destruction simply just by reassigning people, not allowing enforcement to proceed, allowing the people to retire, discouraging them, disheartening them, degrading them, all of that. And that's something that the Founding Fathers hadn't really thought of how we deal with. So there are not a lot of tools beyond the budget and the oversight to deal with a boss who wants to degrade his staff and ruin his agency. It wasn't kind of what was on the founders' mind when they we're setting things up. So that's the real danger. We don't have a very good solution to that. And at EPA and at the State Department, I think, are two places we're seeing a lot of that right now. Coming down the, I should probably try to have the questions being relatively near to the microphones.
Senator Whitehouse, thank you for the great speech. Many national organizations are currently working on all sorts of climate policies at the state and federal level, including carbon taxes, fee and dividends, or renewable portfolios. In light of all the full network of science denial that you mentioned, what climate action policies would you say would be most politically workable in terms of impact and international leadership?
From a political point of view, I think anything that gets developed across multiple states has an easier lift against the political machinery of the fossil fuel polluters. The political machinery of the fossil fuel polluters has intensely focused on Congress. So there's a little bit more flexibility, a little bit less immediate punishment, a little bit less political capacity down at the state level. So we're all in RGGI here, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and with the recent election in New Jersey, we're probably going to add New Jersey back to RGGI, and Virginia has just announced that it wants to join, and we just lifted the RGGI standards by about 30%. It's still pretty weak, but it's big at this point, and you can build, I think, more momentum once you get multiple states working together. Congress is just a particularly challenging place because it's been the particular focus of the fossil fuel industry, and once Citizens United was passed, everything changed. From a policy point of view, I'm a supporter of a price on carbon. You don't have to deal with the trading issues, which after 2008 and the Wall Street meltdown and all that is a lift that we do not need to carry in order to solve this problem. Second, it becomes very easy to reconcile internationally border to border. You can basically look at the carbon price and see if it matches, and if it doesn't, you have a border adjustable tariff, whereas regulatory regimes are much harder to compare to one another. And third, if you put the fee in the way we do at the very top, at the point of entry, at the mine mouth, at the wellhead, then it flows down through the entire economy and it influences decisions that are made by people who don't even think they're making environmental decisions. So you have a much broader impact than simply taking a plan like the Clean Power Plan that looks at the power plant emissions. So I think for a lot of reasons, a price on carbon is the right thing to do. And it has the added advantage of being the place where virtually every Republican who's thought this through to a solution comes to for their solution. So if that's where they want to be and it's a perfectly legitimate way to solve the problem, why fight with them on it? I'm for yes, let's do it your way. The problem is that between where they are and the carbon price is this political kill zone that the fossil fuel industry has set up to basically terrorize them into submission. And Bob Inglis, I think, spoke about this when he was here, and he's a living example of what happens to you. I mean, they took him out with the kind of numbers it usually takes an indictment to create, and he was a legit Southern conservative with a 100% conservative union voting record when they took him out. So they play rough. And don't for a minute, by the way, don't for a minute believe when you hear that the CEO of Exxon or the CEO of Chevron or the CEO of Shell are saying that climate change is a real problem and our fossil fuel product is causing it and we support a price on carbon. Please don't believe them when they say that, because they're not telling the truth. I can tell you firsthand that from the CEO suite, where they may wave that little flag, but you go down to the gun decks of their political operation that surrounds Congress, that message has totally not gotten through to their gun decks. You look at the US Chamber of Commerce, the American Petroleum Institute, all the groups that they influence and that they push, Americans for Progress, all of that stuff, it is all still 100% dedicated to threatening the extermination of any Republican who should cross them on this issue. And until that changes, until the message that they claim publicly becomes their policy politically, you cannot take them at face value. I know it stuns you to think that this industry might be untruthful, but there you go. I've said it. How about right here, closer to the microphone? She's right there. She's coming your way.
Yeah, speaking of extermination, it's not only humans that are affected by climate change, but other species are perhaps even more greatly impacted by it. And that's the other great environmental challenge of this age is mass extinction of other species created by human activity. And yet, every day we hear about climate change, but we hear nothing from Washington about extinction. And I'm wondering why. You don't want to play these two issues off against one another since they're interrelated. But at the same time, all the publicity is going to climate change. At least we're getting a debate, and at least these phony research institutes are creating furor around it. But the attention paid to species extinction, which is equally a great problem, seems to be virtually nil. Why?
I think partly because individual species have such different circumstances that it's hard to legislate a solution. If you're going to go to a commonality, the strongest commonality is probably climate change. So solve that, and then let's see where we go from there. But the same principle that I'm concerned about, where an industry uses countermeasures to deny the science and so forth, can apply to extinctions as well. I mean, if you look at what neonicotinoids appear to be doing to bees, which perform a fairly vital function for us, enormous amount of free labor out there in the fields pollinating our plants, you know, there's a case to be made that we need to address that very, very seriously, and yet the climate and science denial crowd is pushing back against that as well. But I do think it's a matter of scale and differentiation. If we can solve climate change, a lot of the rest begins to solve itself, and then you can focus in from a platform of the ship isn't sinking, and now what do we need to do to make it better?
This is same kind of question that I asked Bob Inglis. Let me see if I can add another arrow to your quiver. So this is not beside, but in addition to. I say solar is civil defense. And we've seen in Houston and in the Caribbean the kind of decimation that's happened because of the hurricane seasons. We all know that there's going to be a weather emergency, whatever we believe about climate change. We don't know if it's going to be a drought or a flood or a blizzard or whatever. But everybody knows that something's going to happen within the next year, 5-year, decade that we have to prepare for. There's going to be a weather emergency. The idea that a certain an emergency disaster response based upon renewables is available and affordable and practical seems to me a kind of backdoor way to get agreement with some of the people who deny. And I'm wondering whether that argument has ever surfaced, and if it has it been successful?
I'm not aware of that particular argument surfacing, although the destruction to Puerto Rico and to some of the other Caribbean islands has caused a conversation among a number of us in Congress, including some big players outside of Congress like Elon Musk, as should we see this as an opportunity to rebuild a resilient local solar web. I mean, there are a lot of these islands that run off diesel that has to be barged in. My God, the sun beams down on them like nobody's business, and the trade winds blow through a lot of these islands 24/7. People anchor their boats at night in a way that they know it's going to end up in the same place in the morning, because if it spun the other way, they'd crash. They're betting their boat on the fact that that wind will always blow and always in that direction. And so I think there's a real capacity in some of these places. You know, I'm willing to ascribe a lot of mischief to the fossil fuel industry, but a good deal of this is just kind of entropy. And a storm is disruptive, and it can break up the entropy as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. One of the things you mentioned is that institutions like MIT actually have an important role to play. A key challenge is to demystify the science so that it actually gets to the common person who doesn't understand the science as much. So what can we do? What can we do in terms of being part of institutions like this to get the message out in a broader way that then counters some of the fake science that's out there?
Well, my call in the speech is that you have to think about actually setting up the equivalent of a police department or a fire department or a rescue department that can respond. You have to have a spotlight department or an honesty department or a truth department or whatever you'd call it, because asking an individual scientist whose work is being challenged, I mean, unless you're Michael Mann, he's been able to fight back, but a lot of people just get rolled, and even he had to change universities. So it's not, and you look at some of the things that have happened in his personal life, it's not pretty what has been threatened and how he's had to defend himself. Even Jane Mayer had investigators sicked on her by the Koch brothers for her temerity in writing Dark Money about how they're manipulating all of this. So I think the best way to do that is to counterattack, and it's too foul to replicate it and just do back to them what they do to us. We can't go around lying about them. That is too degrading. But we can do what we're good at, which is to investigate things, spotlight things, make connections, show how this works, and then name it and shame it, and go after it faster than they can rebuild, and make it a real point to tear down this false apparatus of lies and denial behind which the fossil fuel industry operates. That is a doable thing. One other thing, just because Rhode Island is the ocean state, and you guys, I was just over at your MIT Sea Grant facility, the oceans actually are a pretty good witness for us. They're a good place to talk about, because the fossil fuel denial apparatus has really focused on denying a certain segment of the climate information, particularly quarreling over long-term computer atmospheric models, which have a certain amount of complexity baked into them. So they are hard to explain. But sea level rise is not hard to explain, even though that woman who was going to be the CEQ didn't understand that the principle of thermal expansion actually applied in seawater as well. You can actually measure temperature with a thermometer, and people understand thermometers. And you can actually measure the resulting sea level rise with basically a glorified yardstick. And acidification, I've done the experiment on the Senate floor, blowing my breath through a little aquarium ball and watching the water turn blue, and it's not that hard. Everybody who's got a middle school student with an aquarium in their lab knows that you can do the pH test. So, you know, acidification, sea level rise, and ocean warming are things where we kind of have a very powerful rhetorical front against which they have not erected defenses, and we can, I think, take advantage of that. Instead, we tend to go where they're quarreling and add to the quarrel, and that continues their meta message, which is, you see there's a quarrel here. You don't need to do anything until we've sorted out the quarrel, so keep on burning the fuel. Yeah.
So a lot of people, or at least some people argue that the fossil fuel industry is better, at least economically, compared to renewable energy. And while that might not necessarily be true, how do you think we can go about changing both that perception and also changing over to renewable energy and renewable materials that are better for the environment?
There tend to be really, when you're starting to talk about economics, there tend to be really good ways to measure that. So the number of people who are employed in an industry is a knowable fact. And the amount of employment that is exploding in solar and wind is a knowable fact, and it's more than coal mining. And I think wind turbine installers and maintainers is actually the fastest growing job in the country right now. So that's going to continue, particularly as battery technology evolves and all of this. It becomes an industry. Chuck Grassley is my chairman on the Senate Judiciary Committee. He is not a particularly green individual, but by God, he's going to fight for wind power. And he's going to fight for wind power because more than 35% of Iowa's electricity comes from wind. And as you drive around Iowa, you see those Mid-America Power green pickup trucks going out to service the wind turbines, which you see all over the place, and Iowa farmers who don't maybe care much about climate change do care about getting a $5,000 or $10,000 check every year for each single wind turbine that is located on their farm. So it creates an economic constituency, and I think that's very powerful. On the flip side is the pricing. You know what this stuff sells for, and the curve downward of solar and of wind has been really profound. We got the first offshore wind turbines built in Rhode Island. I think they came in at 18 cents per kilowatt hour. That's pretty expensive. The next generation is going to come in at like 6 cents. So it's really steep downward. I was in Bonn also, and some of the folks we were talking to were talking about what they were seeing for solar bids coming in, and it's 2.5 cents, 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So at that point, you can't say that it is unfair to the developing community in the Central African Republic to not have the benefit of coal electricity piped in over wires that somebody has to build from a faraway facility when it's actually cheaper to put in the solar. You got the battery technology that makes it 24/7. You don't have to build the long lines across the countryside to get the power in. The proposition just begins to solve itself. And I think we're kind of at that tipping point in most places, not unlike these guys. Nobody's building landlines into villages in India or Malaysia or Africa. They're just using this. They're building cell towers. It's much more efficient. They're skipping a technology. And I think the argument that coal is cheaper is very results determined and very hard to substantiate if you take any kind of a look at it. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about the Senate Oceans Caucus, what work you've accomplished, what goals you have for that group?
Senate Oceans Caucus has been kind of cool. I started it when I got there, and with Lisa Murkowski, my colleague from Alaska. And so it was started bipartisan, and it stayed bipartisan. We've got, I think, 36, 38 something members now, more than a third of the Senate. We decided we'd have to stay away from climate change because that was too toxic an issue, but there were other issues we could work on, and we chose pirate fishing, marine plastic debris, and ocean data monitoring. We were successful on the pirate fishing. We passed 4 fisheries treaties, including the Port States Measures Treaty, which is the big one on this, and the bill that puts the law into effect, the enabling legislation for the United States for the Port States Measures Treaty, and that kind of launched a whole enforcement regime on the technical side that's really cool, so that you can track boats that are now illegally fishing in a whole new way because there's a whole new measure of enforcement. So that's been, I think, a considerable success. We passed the 4 treaties in a day once we'd gotten it all organized, and it had been 9 years to go back through the last 4 treaties the Senate cleared. So it was kind of fun to be there clearing all those treaties in a single day. Then we went on to marine plastic debris, and we've passed the Save Our Seas Act, the first marine debris legislation that the Senate's ever taken up unanimously. And we're waiting for the House to act on it. And we have directions in the new NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Bill, for the Coast Guard and the Navy to come up with a plan to help enforce on pirate fishing because there are essentially slave ships out there. And the precedent is the slave patrols that the US Navy ran a century and change ago. And the second is a direction to our trade negotiators to take up the plastic waste that is flowing out of half a dozen Asian countries more than any place else. So that's all been good. I mean, unanimous consent. It's been going great. We did have a bleak moment in the hearing when everything was looking good. We had Republicans and Democrats saying nice things. The witnesses were in agreement. This never happens, by the way, in EPW. So I'm sitting there just, I can't believe this is happening. This is so cool. And then who walks in but Jim Inhofe, Snowball Man. And he and I have gone at it over climate change a lot. when he did his snowball thing on the Senate floor, his theory, I guess, being that the continued existence of snow disproves climate change. I was the one who went to the floor and made fun of the senator with the snowball, and we'd go back and forth. So he comes in, and I think, oh, why couldn't he have just stayed away? Give me one good day here. And he sat down, and it came his turn, and he said, I like this hearing, and I like this bill, and marine plastic debris is something we do need to be concerned about. When I was a young man, I used to go from Oklahoma down to the Gulf Coast, and I would sit up all night long with my folding chair and my flashlight and my cooler, and I'd wave the trucks and the Jeeps that are coming up and down the beach away from the little turtles that had come out of their shells and were going down to the ocean. To be blunt, I thought he'd be rooting for the trucks. And it was a touching moment to see my nemesis say, you're right about this, and this is a thing I care about. He became a co-sponsor of the bill. He's like a human beacon, safe to land for other Republicans. So, boom, the bill passes unanimous consent, and he just joined the Oceans Caucus. He's our newest member from Oklahoma. Who knew? Little successes, yeah.
Senator,
Sorry.
If you are good to go for another 15 minutes,
I'm at your pleasure.
great, excellent.
In the wake of that story, earlier you said that your Republican colleagues are, I think you said, terrified into submission.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, not just to be gossipy, but also because I'm a PhD student in climate science, and I'm trying to figure out where to focus my efforts here. How many of your Republican colleagues actually get it in private? And how many of them, these are the people who I assume are terrified into submission, and how many of them truly believe that this is a global conspiracy?
Maybe 2 believe or 3 believe it's a global conspiracy. Very few, very few. There's a guy named Jerry Taylor, who was a very conservative economist. He was the #2 guy at Cato Institute, which is one of these denial shops. And he was in charge of climate denial. But he's also an honest intellectual, and the more he looked at it, the more he realized, wait a minute, the science isn't adding up here, and the things I'm being asked to say aren't truthful or logical. So he bailed and published a very interesting confessional about what he had been doing, and he's talking to a lot of Republican senators. He says there are about 8 who he thinks are ready to do something on climate. In my personal conversations, I think the number's about the same. I think once you get a first wave of 4 or 5 or 6, the 8 becomes 12 pretty quickly. But talking to these guys about climate change is like talking to prisoners about escape. The first thing they do is look around to see who's listening if you're on the Senate floor, and you got to go to a quiet place. One person said, you're doing the right thing, and I want you to keep doing it, and I want to help you when I can. So keep in touch, but don't let my staff know we're talking about this. Because somebody will rat them out to, Americans for Progress, and they'll get the call. And as Paulson once said to me, yeah, they've all gotten the call. So it's a little frustrating, but now you've got a whole lot of them who are, for one reason or another, not running again. You've got many who have very good records on this issue back beforehand. And I think the focus, I put the focus in 2 places. One is on universities. State universities could do a lot better at stepping up on this. Ohio State, Georgia State. It's one thing for MIT to say this. Everybody knows you guys are, wonky elitists. And but when it's Georgia State or Kansas State or Mississippi State or Ole Miss or whomever, that has a different flavor. And you can go to every single state university in the country, I think, except Alabama State. That may be the one. And they are teaching, they're not just understanding climate science, they are teaching climate science. They're giving grants out to people to study climate science. So they're a really good set of voices that have been heard from way too little. The other is that as young people and consumers, I think we all need to step up what we require of our good guy companies. Because here's what's interesting. The best private corporations on this subject come to Congress and completely fall down. Completely fall down. Google, Apple, Microsoft, and Facebook. If I name 4 corporations in the world that are possibly more powerful than those 4. I mean, they're just enormous, right? And they come to Congress and they reach out to us through a trade association called TechNet. And they're not alone in supporting TechNet. Sunrun, Solar City, Bloom Energy, there are a bunch of actual green energy companies that are part of the TechNet Collaborative. So the TechNet Collaborative came in again this year, led by Kleiner Perkins climate guy, John Doerr. And they had their presentation and they had their nifty, high gloss, fancy, super presentation booklet. And they had 6 priorities for Congress that we urgently needed to address. Guess what was not on the list of priorities? Climate change. Guess what was not mentioned anywhere in the book? Climate change. Even with green energy companies in their membership, they didn't even make green or clean or renewable energy one of their 6 priority areas. Coke and Pepsi lobby us through the American Beverage Association, which has to report its spending and has never spent a dime to do a thing on climate change. What it does is it runs money through to the US Chamber of Commerce, which as a lobbying entity is probably my #1 nemesis and enemy. They are just totally against anything on climate change, period, end of story, dead to me if you do it. And so here Coke and Pepsi, which have great policies, do wonderful things, push it out their supply chain, communicate it, reach out to customers, and then their lobbying presence in Congress is 100% antithetical to their stated policy. We ought to be able to ask America's leading corporations to have a lobbying policy that is consistent with their actual policy. That really ought not be too much to ask. And organizing how you do that is, I think, part of the trick so that consumers can know and you can get reliable sourcing on this stuff. But I tell you what, if corporate America stood up in Congress on this issue, they could blow the fossil fuel industry folks. They look terrifying because they are terrifying because nobody else is on the field. But if anybody else would show up on the field in any kind of clout, suddenly all the prisoners are willing to talk. And now off we go, and we're looking at a carbon fee. And it's like, the prisoners want to get out. We agree on the getaway car, the carbon price. And all we need is somebody to put a hole in the fence between. And if Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Bank of America, BlackRock, Coke, Pepsi, all of these good climate companies won't do that, well, somebody needs to give them a little shove. Yeah.
I'm a graduate student at the state school here in Massachusetts, actually, and I'm also on the National Board of Directors for a conservation society. We try to save whales. And
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. It's tough. But actually, my advisor is the head of research at the aquarium, and we study the North Atlantic right whale. So
yeah,
if you
which
know
is
anything
having
about species
a horrible
extinction,
time, about to be extinct.
Exactly. I just came back
They're
from
getting
2
killed.
conferences in Canada, and I see a lot of people my age that are very dissuaged. They're just very
disheartened.
Yeah, disheartened. Absolutely. Thank you. What type of, what type of advice might you give people my age to work with teaming with these giants that can battle this industry that you're talking about? Because we are orders of magnitude less funded on both sides, and it's impossible.
A lot of these companies are very, very sensitive reputationally, and so if you pursue them publicly, I think you can have an effect. You've got to be organized, so whether it's through 350 or through Greenpeace or through Sierra Club or through whomever, I think it is important that there be an accountability moment for this kind of mischief. One of the things we did in Bonn was to have a press conference to call out the American automobile industry for walking back on its promise to meet the new CAFE standards. They didn't just make that promise with the Obama administration. They made it to all of us. And the fact that the Obama administration is gone doesn't mean they can walk away from it at a time when European car companies are announcing the end of the internal combustion engine in their vehicles. For Ford, and particularly Ford, to be able to say, no, we can't do that. We want out of the commitment that we made. You know, they shouldn't be able to walk away from that free. Again, it's the trade association that's up to the mischief, but they've got to have accountability for those decisions. And I think a lot of that is, it's doable in this internet age. It's more doable than ever to have something go viral, be consequential, and force changes in corporate behavior. And I think that's what you can do. And don't get disheartened. It's too important to get disheartened over. When you get disheartened, give yourself a kick and get back in the fight. Yeah.
First, I just wanted to thank you for your leadership in the Senate, and particularly in the judiciary. On your question, actually, being disheartened, I actually find a lot of hope in the work that you are all doing. So thank you for your leadership in all the...
Thank you.
on all the important issues of our day. I have a quick question, and I'll preface it by saying I don't actually expect an answer, but I will ask it because I would be honored to vote for you. And with your last name, the question asks itself, would you consider a run for the White House?
Thank you. That's a very flattering question, and I appreciate it, but no. My dream is to, A, get reelected, and B, go sit down and meet with the Democratic president in the White House. And if that could happen before 2020, I'd settle for that too. Yeah, front and center, right. Coming your way with the mic.
Hi, going back to the question of what universities can do, I'm curious about your thoughts on how we can use our current connections to industry. In the case of MIT, one of the Koch brothers is on our board. We have a lot of research funding from these companies. We invest in them. So what are your thoughts on trying to change them on the inside through engagement versus making a principled statement by disengaging?
You know, I think that they merit suspicion. You know, we always believe in redemption and that everybody's got a good heart someplace. So, and you do see the Charles Koch Foundation supporting like NPR programs on climate change, which always makes my head torque a little bit. But I think you just have to be super alert to A, the danger of mischief, and B, kind of just, it's not quite greenwashing, but trying to make their behavior look better by associating themselves with really legitimate institutions and giving them something else to talk about at cocktail parties than the wickedness that they're doing in our politics and to our world. But the mischief factor is really high. I was one of the 4 co-authors of the criminal sentencing reform bill, the lead co-authors. And one of the interesting things about that was the Koch brothers were very noticeably involved in trying to help that. And there was this kind of bizarre, strange bedfellows coalition that got a lot of attention of the Koch brothers and the NAACP and the criminal defense lawyers and everybody coming together to negotiate. I thought, okay, well, maybe I should like reserve judgment on them. And we negotiated all this for a while. And then when it kind of got ready to be game day, all of a sudden, boom, there was this like spontaneous explosion from 5 different quarters of a different reform that suddenly needed to get into this bill that happens to be the thing that makes corporate polluters criminally liable. And their guy who'd been working this suddenly was their, like, it was called the mens rea issue, guilty mind. Suddenly, you know, their guy is the person. Suddenly our Judiciary Committee is holding a hearing. Suddenly, good lad over in the House is saying, well, we're never going to move on criminal sentencing reform until you've got mens rea in there. So the conclusion I drew was that their effort on criminal sentencing reform was basically building a Trojan horse so that at the last minute they could stick what they really cared about, which is protecting corporate polluters from criminal liability for their pollution, and try to ram it through, and they'd have built up enough goodwill for that. So, you know, my suspicious mind got confirmed in that one, and I think you just got to be very, very careful about what mischief they're up to and what organizations want to be associated with them. If it's really true that all they want is for, you know, the scientific enterprise to continue here at MIT or whatever it is that they're paying for, I think you've got to be open to that idea, but I think it's an idea that you've got to approach with real skepticism and look under the hood and kick the tires and open and slam the doors and see what they've got in the glove box. And I've become very suspicious about their capacity for doing untainted good deeds. Sorry, but we were
On that note,
no, we gotta do one more because I can't.
one more? Okay, very good. One more.
That's too grim a tone to end on. Ask a happier question.
Well, I hope this will be happy. We'll see. Given the need to do something,
I think your mic needs to be held a little bit.
given the need to do something with the most immediate results, where should we focus to get those immediate results with the longest term benefit? I've got three possibilities. Should we go ahead and focus on changing the makeup of the Senate and House by getting new people in there, both state and federally? Two, should we increase the incentives like RGGI and RPS and carbon tax, which have a longer term impact because industry has to respond to them?
Yeah.
Or should we pick out particular winners right now, like storage and Elon Musk type of initiatives, and really focus on those which do have a proven short-term benefit right now? Or something else that you have in mind that you can enlighten us on?
I think a little bit all of the above, but I think that there is a chance, if the Republicans can't do a purely partisan tax reform bill or tax whatever they call it bill, to move a carbon price into that conversation. And I think that's an immediate prospect that we should at least be open to. And particularly anybody who has the ability to have an influence on Republican views on this, corporate leaders and so forth. You don't need to do much about it now because they need to go through this exercise of a partisan tax effort before they can decide. They think that working with us is a form of defeat, so they have to try it their way first. And if that happens, though, I do think that there's a significant prospect of it. It creates massive revenues. It has intellectual support on the Republican side. There are a whole bunch of Republicans like Jeff Flake, who was a co-sponsor of Bob Inglis's bill in the House that was a carbon price that lowered other taxes. It's fairly easy to pass and implement, and it will allow our beloved president a big victory. He can say, look, I did the deal of the century. You can present it to him as a done deal, and he can, you know, have a signing ceremony and all that kind of stuff. I think that's conceivably very doable. Because the Senate requires 60 votes to become really proactive, the House, I think, has to be the political focus for the 2018 election. A Democratic speaker can tee up legislation in the House, working with Senator Schumer in the Senate, so that when they send that bill down the hallway to the Senate, it is extremely painful for Republicans to oppose. And you can take up issues like student debt and climate change and dark money and things where the public is like 85% with us, and kind of force their hand by forcing votes in reasonable measures that solve those big problems. And I think that's the House is more able to be the proactive entity. And also, everybody's up. Whereas in the Senate, we've got this crappy map of lots of Democrats up, very few Republicans, lots of Trump states with Democrats up, very few Hillary states with Republicans up. Now, the president is very rapidly making the map look better and better and better for us. That's about the one good thing I can say about his presidency. But I think still the House is the more likely place to flip and the more consequential place to have a Democratic leader in, because you can do more proactive work in that body because of the power of the Speaker than in the much more obscurely run Senate. So, final word, you know, hope kind of springs eternal. I had no idea that Inhofe was going to be a co-sponsor of the Marine Debris Bill, and boom, there we are, and it's through the Senate. So, you know, you wait and you wait, and you work and you work, and you lean in and you lean in, and things come and things go, and you sustain your disappointments, and then suddenly a door opens and there you are. And you have to be ready. But there are plenty of things that can be surprisingly good that can happen if we're ready and if we can move and if we can lean in when those moments come. And tax reform, so-called, and the 2018 election are two of those huge, consequential, lean-in moments. So let's try to make the most of them. Thank you all very much for coming out on this evening. I appreciate it.
Please join us, the reception just outside.